Welcome back. This is Mr. Crayson committing hard to the theme of cold for the Cold War Origins video today. So what is the Cold War as opposed to a hot war? This is where two enemy combatants don't face off on a battlefield, but rather ideologically, politically, economically. All these other ways other than just direct combat. So the US and the USSR, or the Soviet Union, are the two countries facing off. At the core of the Cold War is an ideological battle between capitalism and communism. What you have is a system of capitalism where private ownership of all capital occurs. So a private individual will own a factory, the machines in the factory, and they're producing a product. Now, how well their product sells is based on a free market, where people's demand will dictate how well that business does. Communism, on the other hand, is where the capital, the machines, the factories, all of that is collectively owned by the people. In 1848, two German economists, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, wrote all about this in their book, The Communist Manifesto. And they explain that communism was an evolution of humanity to where the lower class proletariats, of which there's many more people in that group, rise up and take the capital away from the bourgeoisie upper class. Now, in this system, technically the wealth gap would disappear and everyone would share and share alike. But in reality, this has not taken place. This collective ownership of capital by the proletariat has never really worked out quite the way that Engels and Marx envisioned. Instead, it's always been dominated by a state, by a country, with a totalitarian leader in charge. Now, what's the timeline of the Cold War? That's highly debatable. There really isn't any one event that triggers it. It's sort of an accumulation of events over time. Some may point to the Potsdam Conference. After Germany had surrendered, Japan was still holding out. And at this Potsdam Conference, the big three met. Truman tells Stalin that he has a new weapon, a new type of weapon. He doesn't say it's an atomic bomb, doesn't go into detail about it, but hints at its devastating capabilities. Now, at that same conference, Truman's going to issue the Potsdam Declaration to Japan, where he offers Japan an ultimatum: surrender now or face utter destruction. And he follows through with that threat, dropping 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. Historians will point at a possible double intention for this. So not only to end the war swiftly, but to be sort of a flex, proving to the world and really to Joseph Stalin that America is on top with the most powerful of weapons at this time. It's almost like a callback to Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, to where power equals better diplomatic leverage. In 1947, Harry Truman gives his Truman Doctrine. This is where he asks Congress for $400 million to aid Greece and Turkey in trying to resist communist infiltration. Greece was fending off communist revolts from within, and Turkey was trying to fend off communist threats to take over its waterways, the Dardanelles and Bosporus. But the Truman Doctrine here is going to solidify a policy known as containment against communism, attempting to try to prevent other nations from falling victim to communist infiltration. During the Cold War, there's a fear that if one nation becomes communist, then it's going to spread to another, then another, then another, like dominoes. In fact, Eisenhower refers to this as the domino theory. So the stakes are high for the U.S. then to stop communism in its tracks when they can. This will happen through multiple proxy wars. So what are proxy wars? Proxy wars are where the U.S. and Soviet Union back third-party nations that are going to fight each other through direct combat. So this happened in Korea from 1950 to 1953. You'll hear all about that in the next video. It happened in Vietnam from 1955 to 1975. In both cases, a northern communist side of the nation faced off against a southern free market capitalist side. And of course, the U.S. backed the South and the Soviets backed the North. The Korean War ends in a victory for Truman's containment policy, but the Vietnam War, unfortunately, will be a complete loss, and Vietnam will fall fully to communist forces. And then you have the US and Soviets competing for financial influence, hoping to sway countries to go either one way or the other, communist or capitalist. Some examples are the Truman Doctrine, $400 million to Greece and Turkey in 1947. You also have the US Marshall Plan, $13 billion offered to European nations to prop up their economies and hopefully keep people satisfied enough not to be swayed by a pull to communism. The Soviets offer something similar to their satellites known as the Molotov Plan, but not as extensive as the Marshall Plan had been. We'll also see a face-off in alliances. The U.S. is going to join its very first permanent entangling alliance ever in 1949 called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a bunch of Western European nations that are afraid of the Soviet Union. The promise of NATO is that if any one of these NATO member nations gets attacked, they will mount a joint response in retaliation. Russia does the same with its satellite nations. In 1955, they create the Warsaw Pact that essentially does exactly what NATO did, but now for them. So you have these two massive alliances that threaten to bring us into a third world war. The Cold War will see an arms race, a buildup of military weaponry. It'll start with the atomic bombs. The U.S. gets the first in 1945 and uses it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A couple years later, in 1949, the Soviets have an atomic bomb. And in the U.S., there's panic that the Soviets will drop it on us. In schools, they're doing nuclear bomb drills. So think about that. Instead of just fire drills and tornado drills, you are practicing going under a desk because the school is being bombed. It escalates to where the U.S. then develops a hydrogen bomb in 1952, about 700 times stronger than the atomic bombs used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, the Soviets 1 year later come back with their own hydrogen bomb. Each side will build bigger and better intercontinental ballistic missiles to fire potential nuclear warheads. It is just a constant escalating battle of building bigger and better weapons of destruction. In 1947, the National Security Council, or NSC, was created, and its purpose was to really plan out foreign policy during the Cold War. Well, it would write these memos of recommendations to the president, and NSC 68 suggested a increasing military buildup. This document is highlighted for its influence in creating a military-industrial complex. The only thing preventing either side from using these is the promise of mutually assured destruction if they did. The arms race coincides with the space race as well. In 1957, the Russians are going to send up the first satellite ever called Sputnik. In Russian, it translates to satellite, so nothing special in the name there. And the American people panicked that now maybe the Russians would have the capability of launching a nuclear weapon across the ocean. Not to be outdone, the U.S. will answer back by creating NASA, by creating the NDEA to try to educate students in American schools to be able to compete scientifically to create a better space program, and even by landing men on the moon in 1969. So that's going to do it for the origins of the Cold War. I think you're pretty well set up to understand the rest of the videos coming at you in a moment. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great rest of the day.